Well, actually, I've got to the stage of life where you feel like paying the people introducing you not to say anything because it makes you feel so old, you know. So thank you very much for those introductions, nevertheless. It is obviously a special pleasure when you come back to any place where you've made friends and you've spent time. And it's great to see some faces here of real, more than colleagues, that they were good friends. So it's a great pleasure. And anybody who is just joining Bath, I hope you realize what a privilege it is to be here, because it's a special place. And don't waste your time, because you will find that the rest of your life you will be relating to your experience of being here. Now, the books that that's just been mentioned, the last two are part of a trilogy. The first book took me 30 years to write and was a struggle with the ILO model of labourism of the 20th century. And I was always discontented with that because I dislike the focus on labour. All forms of work that were not labour suddenly got marginalised by the social scientists, by policymakers, political rhetoric, and so on, so that it has a very distorting effect. When we talk about labour rights, to me it's a contradiction in terms, because rights are universals, and if you only reward certain types of subordinated work and not other forms of work, you're already in a bad place. And if you think of it, the way I start, and I always mention this, you know, is a famous statement by Arthur Pigou in the 1920s. He said if he hires a housekeeper or a cook, national income goes up, employment goes up, economic growth goes up, and unemployment goes down. If he marries her and she continues to do precisely the same work, national income goes down, growth goes down, employment goes down, and unemployment goes up. Now, you can't get more stupid than that, or sexist. But we still have labour statistics and political rhetoric which takes that as the conceptualization of work. So that book was really a struggle to say, well, what if we can get away from labourism? And it has a certain life, that book. But there was one subject, wherever I went, presenting it, where I could hear a pin drop, and that was when I started talking about the precariat. So I decided to try what most academics are sensible enough not to try, which is to try and write a book that was approachable for lay people and undergraduates, but also for academics. And you risk falling in between two stools because your academics say, not enough statistics, and your lay people who see a few statistics say, no, it's too complicated for me. So you risk falling in between. And then, of course, I got to the point where the precariat was having a life of its own. And I had a discussion with a rather more famous person than myself or any of us in the room, and he was talking to me, and I said, look, there is a need to move forward. And that's where this new book has come, an attempt. Next year is the 800th anniversary of what is commonly regarded as the foundation of the British Constitution and the foundation of the Constitution of many other countries, including the United States and various other countries. Of course, it is the Magna Carta, except it isn't. Because the Magna Carta was only created in 1217. In 1215, when King John and the barons agreed on it, it was called the Charter of Liberties. And it was actually a dead letter within a couple of months. It had the king's imprint in June 1215, and by September he'd rebuked his barons, and they were back fighting. But the final document that came out in 1217 was very interesting because it not only had changed a lot of the wording, but there was a separate Charter of the Forests. The Charter of Liberties that became the Magna Carta is very important for my narrative because it was the first class-based set of demands against the state for rights, for the emerging mass class. And the Charter of the Forests was an assertion of rights of the common man. The Guardian recently had an article by its young journalist Owen Jones, who said, for the working class, the Magna Carta is a lot of twaddle. Well, he clearly hasn't studied it, because there are phenomenal parts of that and the Charter of the Forests which are about the rights to the commons, the rights for the ordinary person, the rights to be able to have space for work and so on. It's a very radical document. And the interesting thing is that of the 63 articles of the Magna Carta, just four, have remained extant today. And those four are fundamental to what I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes. Now, I was talking to this person, avoiding name dropping, but talking to him, and I said, look, what would a Precariat Charter look like in the 21st century? What sort of demands would the Precariat be making on the state? And how would a Precariat Charter differ from a Proletariat Charter 100 years ago? In a sense, it's a game you're playing with yourself, but you're actually trying to think through what sort of demands different groups or different classes would actually give as the priorities that they make their demands. Now, if you go back to the Magna Carta, and I realize next year is going to be full of it. I've already received a number of invitations, including one to Salisbury Cathedral, where one of the only four remaining documents, the original documents, and they're fascinating, and a number of others already. And it's fascinating because you could read the Magna Carta. It's a single piece of paper. And one of the copies sold 7 years ago for over £21 million, you know. So whoever had it before was made a lot of money. But of course, you look at the Charter, and you can trace through our history and through other countries' histories where each time an emerging class and a transformation is taking place, that class has started to make demands against the state. And of course, in British history, you've got the 1689, the Bill of Rights, and then you've got through to the Chartists of the 1830s, and all of it you can interpret as class-based demands against the state, of the emerging classes. Now, I want to put that aside for a moment and give the picture of the context, and then come to defining what the hell I mean by the precariat. All right? The context is that in the 1980s, we, as a global society, were set on the first phase of a global transformation, in the sense that Karl Polanyi had developed the Great Transformation. Any of you who are just becoming students must regard that text as something that you must read. Put down, must read. Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. But his Great Transformation was about the painful construction of national market societies. And the first phase of a transformation, which he called a disembedded phase, is when the economic system takes off and the old systems of regulation, social protection, and redistribution break down. And in that disembedded phase, it's dominated by financial capital, the bankers and the anchors and other things like that, the financiers. And in that period, the inequalities and insecurities multiply until you have a crisis. And then, as Polanyi put it, at that point you have a threat of the annihilation of civilization, which of course when he was writing in the 1940s meant fascism and all the terrors that were taking place at that time. And he then said that if there is to be a transformation, there will be a re-embedded phase. He didn't say there will be. He said that if there is to be a transformation, those must take place. And of course, that was labourism and the welfare states and all those labour regulations and collective bargaining that we all know from our textbooks. But that broke down in the 1980s when you had the beginning of a global transformation, which is about the painful construction of a global market system. And what we have been going through is the disembedded phase of the global transformation, which involved the triumph of what we nowadays call neoliberalism. Those are, again, it's a word that bandied around, usually insulting, but it actually had very specific characteristics, the neoliberalism. It was essentially a statement that a market system should be highly individualistic, highly privatized. You should commodify everything that can be commodified, in other words, make things subject to market forces. And you should go for the pursuit of one of the euphemisms of our age, competitiveness. You can never be competitive enough. You have to be more competitive than you. You have to be more competitive than me. The rage for competitiveness has been the symbol of the neoliberal agenda. But underneath, very critically, and anybody involved in social policy knows that this is the case, that the whole emphasis of Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and all the Mont Pelerin Society who dominated that period and went on to receive Nobel Prizes like confetti, the essential objective was to dismantle all institutions and mechanisms of social solidarity. That was a key part of the agenda, because all institutions of social solidarity stand against the market. They try and protect people or protect things from market forces. So it's very key to their whole strategy. But of course, what was really happening in the 1980s was that we were opening up markets globally. And what happened historically is that in a twinkle, there was a quadrupling of the world's labour supply. A quadrupling of the number of people who were exposed to the international market. 2 billion extra people suddenly became available to work for capital. Now, you don't have to have a PhD in economics to realize that that is going to put huge downward pressure on wages and living standards in the OECD countries. Because all those 2 billion workers were habituated to living standards of 1/50th of any of us in this room. So there's going to be downward pressure, particularly as there was a technological revolution taking place, which made it far, far easier to relocate production and employment and affect the division of labour and raise productivity levels dramatically in those emerging market economies. So productivity was going up, which lowered labour costs even more, and of course our wages came under downward pressure. But governments in the rich countries could not afford politically to allow wages to plunge. So in effect they made a Faustian bargain with all of us. A Faustian bargain which said you can have an orgy of consumption. We're going to have cheap credit, cheap labour subsidies, employment subsidies, marginal employment subsidy, tax credits, more tax credits, more tax credits. What does this do? It builds up huge debt. And sooner or later, the orgy of consumption had to come to an end. The Faustian bargain doesn't go on forever. And that, of course, happened in 2007, 2008 with the financial crisis, since when we're in the austerity era around the world where everybody's being told that they have to lower their living standards and cut their benefits, etc., etc. But meanwhile, the old system of income distribution of the 20th century, which was essentially a bargaining process between capital and labour, where the wage share went up a little or down a little, but it was essentially a bargain, that system has collapsed. Because the bargaining position of workers everywhere has gone down. So the rising functional income inequality, where the share of national income and global income going to capital has gone up hugely. But not just in profits. What has happened is, and I disagree with Thomas Piketty, whose book most of you will be aware of, if most of you haven't read it, because it's like a great Bible, and triple Bible. But what we've seen is the development of rentier capitalism. Huge shares of national income going to the holders of patents, brands, more patents, more brands, copyright. So now the dominant international body has shifted from WTO in the 1990s, an early part of this century, to WIPO. I happen to live outside Geneva, and the great big shining building that is dominating the center of Geneva today is WIPO. They're building a huge complex in the center of Geneva, and somehow it symbolizes the changing character of global capitalism. And which country has become the biggest recorder of patents? China. Which company in the world has more patents than any other company? It's Foxconn of China, which has over 12,000 patents. What's important about patents is it guarantees anybody who registers a patent at least 20 years of monopoly income. And if you think of the incredible development of intellectual property regimes, you will see the character of global capitalism is changing. But we're seeing a great convergence of wages, and wages are going down in all industrialized countries. The last 30 years, there has been several developments. Wages, in real wage terms, have gone down slightly. And whereas they used to, when productivity went up, wages went up in parallel, now there's a phenomenon which is called the jaws of the snake. The wages have gone along like this over time, productivity has gone up like that. And in numerous countries, the jaws of the snake have been opening wider and wider. This is not a single country phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. Now, wage differentials have risen, we know that, bargaining positions and all that. But what has been happening underneath this is that a global class structure has been taking shape, superimposed, and I always try and emphasize this, superimposed on old national class structures. Hasn't completely removed semi-feudal relations in some parts of the world, peasant structures and so on, of course not. But globally the trend has been towards what I'm about to say, and I'm very pleased to say that a number of PhD dissertations are beginning to emerge which are documenting and measuring the phenomenon that are taking place. At the top, we have a plutocracy. It's not the top 1%, it's the top 0.001% of billionaires, multi-billionaires, etc., who are rentiers, often buying up huge numbers of patents, and often with plutocratic corporations that are part of the plutocracy. I won't focus on those because I've got to get to the precariat, but that is at the top. And they're dominating politics, they're dominating the media, they're dominating the discourse, they're dominating universities with their largesse. They have enormous power. Below them is an elite, hangers-on, making their money from capital. And a long way below them is the old salariat that was expected to become the norm. Back in the 60s and 70s, labour analysts who were writing at the time were predicting the professionalization of everybody, and everyone would be in salaried employment by the end of the century. It's gone in the reverse. Salariat have strong employment security. They have pensions, they have medical leave, they have bonding sessions in golf clubs where they can drink stewed coffee in the morning and heavy whiskey in the afternoon. They have all the trappings that go with that salaried lifestyle. But their numbers are shrinking. And they're getting worried because a lot of their children and their neighbours are not in the salariat. Now, alongside the salariat in terms of income, there's a group of what I call proficients. Some of you in this room may aspire to be proficients. These are people, they don't want employment security. That's for wimps. They're project-oriented, they're self-entrepreneurial, they've got all their technology over their shoulder or in their iPhone or whatever it might be. They make a phenomenal amount of money rushing around, and consultancies. The only problem is they risk burnout at age 29 and a half, approximately. You know, you see them at any station or airport, you see plenty of them. Below them, and a long way below them in terms of income, is the old proletariat. Now, the key part of the proletariat was the process of what the labour historians like Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson and others said was proletarianization. And proletarianization meant habituating people to a lifetime of stable, full-time labour. You got up in the morning, you went, you clocked in, you had your 10 hours labour, you went home in the evening, if you had energy, you had a bit of sex, and then you went to bed. And life continued. You went to school for a bit, then you had 30 years of labour, 2 years of retirement, and then dropped dead. You know, this was the labour model of the proletariat, and the whole thing about proletarianization was habituation to a stable full-time labour. But the proletariat, which fought for and built the welfare state and all those labour regulations and so on, has been weakening and shrinking all over the world. I spend a lot of my time working in India at the moment. It's not growing even there, even though they have high economic growth. It's ditto in China. So the proletariat is shrinking. It's below the proletariat that we have the emerging precariat. And I want to say that it's very, very important, analytically and politically, to differentiate the precariat from the lumpen precariat, the underclass, the people out in the streets dying of social illnesses and drug addiction and all the victims who've not been able to cope. They might have been in part of the precariat before, but that is not the precariat. The precariat is wanted by multinational capital and by the whole neoliberal project because it is essentially a type of labour that goes with the globalization that's taking place. Now, how do we define the precariat? It is an evolving concept. I make no apology for that. When one is trying to look at how things are developing, one's first attempt to conceptualize are inevitably clumsy, not complete, looking for nuances, etc. But I think you can define the precariat in 3 dimensions. The first dimension is they're defined by distinctive relations of production, to use a Marxian term. And that, of course, means that people in the precariat are expected to have unstable labour, insecure labour statuses. They're interns, they're zero-hour contracts, they're permanent temporaries, they're casuals, they're part-timers who are expected to be paid part-time but are actually expected to work full-time. There are all these categories. And the biggest emerging category which has yet to come across the horizon in analytical terms is crowd labour. Some predictions now are saying that within the next decade, 1/3 of all labour not contracts is a bit strong a word, but 1/3 of all labour agreements will be done online through a global Dutch auction system. Already millions of people are doing that. So they're competing with one another. You might be in Boston, Massachusetts, and Bath. You'll be competing with somebody in Dakar or Nairobi. And of course the Dutch auction process, they put out and say, well, we need some tasks done, not just low-level tasks, it goes all the way through the system, and we want bidding by next Friday. And whoever has the lowest bid on Friday will get the contract. So people are competing against each other, driving down the wages of people working. You think that's subject to labour regulations? You think they get social benefits? You're kidding. You think they're protected when they're not paid? You're kidding. This is taking place, and of course you have a very strange thing that's happening underneath all that, because what we're seeing is the migration of labour without the migration of workers. Never seen that before. It's part of this changing process. But this part of the definition is actually, for me, the least interesting. Everybody who's commentated thinks that that is the main part of the definition of the precariat. And however many times I say the opposite, I'm sure somebody's going to go out of this room and say, well, Standing says that. Okay? Much more important are some of the other features. And the next one, I think, many of us can understand. If you're in the precariat today, you don't have an occupational identity, an occupational narrative that you can give to your life. I'm becoming something. I am something. And in retirement, I can tell my grandchildren, I was something. People in the precariat might be doing this one day, you meet them 2 weeks later, they're doing something completely different. 3 months later, they're out of work. So it's a lack of occupational career that you can give to your life. There's equally no corporate narrative. You don't belong to a zone of citizenship in a big corporation if you're in the precariat. You might be working for 20 different employers in the course of 1 year, let alone over your lifetime. But there are other features too. People in the precariat have to do an incredibly high ratio of work for labour relative to labour. It's an extraordinary phenomenon that you meet people, and I've received thousands of emails of people wanting to tell me that this relates to them, so that a very small proportion of the total time that people spend working is actually remunerated. Form filling, more form filling, networking, retraining, finding that your retraining is going nowhere because your skills are obsolescent, because technology, retrain, renet. You don't know what to do that is the best for you. And this leads to a phenomenon that I've discussed in the precariat, which is the precariatized mind. You don't know what's the best thing. So all of us spend enormous, but maybe there'll be a few more emails coming in that just settles. Maybe this, maybe that. But this creates incredibly stressful circumstances. Another feature, which I don't think has been given enough attention, probably by me, but also by commentators, is this is the first working class in history which is expected to have a level of education greater than the level of labour it is expected to do. That, of course, creates tremendous status frustrations and stress, which I'll come back to. And the last part of the relations of production I want to emphasize, there are a few other issues in the book, is that we have moved into an era of tertiary time. Industrial time was, as I said earlier, in blocks. Working hours, workplaces made sense. They were different from home places. Working hours were different from non-working hours. But we are living in a tertiary time era when everything crowds into everything else, and our labour statistics are still back in the early part of the 20th century. So if you see a figure in the newspaper that says the average working time is 8.2 hours per day, or 36.12 hours per week, all you know is that's garbage. All you know is garbage. And our statistic, we really must put pressure on them to be changed. The second dimension, and I'm having to be brief because I'm looking at the time, and Anna's going to get at me soon. The second is that the precariat has distinctive relations of distribution. What that means is that it actually has to rely almost entirely on money wages. And money wages are more volatile than they used to be, more erratic, and are falling. So this puts people in the precariat always on the vulnerable edge of needing to borrow and constantly being on the edge of unsustainable debt. We all know the stories from the newspapers, but this again is not a Wonga payday loan thing solely in this country. It's all over the world. Millions and millions of Americans are deep in chronic debt that they have no possible chance of paying the debts off in their working lifetime. The same in Latin America. In Brazil, I was recently in Brazil, the average person has to spend 25% of their weekly income in servicing their debts. So it's a global phenomenon, and debt is a mechanism of exploitation, not just an incidental thing. But a lot of people in the precariat are in what we call poverty traps. If they need short-term benefits, their means tested, their behavior tested, and they take the benefits, and Ian Duncan Smith, in his beautiful wisdom, is always wanting to cut them because he wants to say that make work pay. Well, if your wages are going down and your benefits are static, you're constantly going to have a situation where the replacement rate of benefits appears to be going up. It's not because benefits are going up, it's because wages are coming down. But people in many countries, when they go from low benefit, whatever benefit might be, to a low-wage job, are effectively facing a marginal tax rate of over 80%. In this country, it's 80%, the estimate. If Ian Duncan Smith gets his way, and we all think it's highly unlikely, he boasts that he will reduce it to 65%. Meanwhile, they're cutting corporation tax for capital to 20%. And they're cutting tax rates on the middle class and the salariat to, if they can, 30%. So even if they get away with their reforms, they're still expecting the precariat to pay twice as much in a marginal tax rate. Other countries it's the same. In Germany, in Denmark, it's all over 80%. Lots of countries, the poverty trap. Wait for it. On top of the poverty trap, there is what I call in the books the precarity trap. Because the precarity trap, there are many forms of precarity trap. The most typical is this. Supposing you lose a low-wage job and you want to apply for benefits. You think you're going to get it tomorrow morning? You will go with papers and queue up. You will take the wrong bus to the wrong place. You'll be talking in the wrong tone of voice and be sent back to the queue. You will be finding that you haven't got the right documents, and you'll go back. And then you'll raise your voice and lose your temper and be sent back again. And it turns out that millions of people around Europe and the United States have to spend months before they get their benefits that they're due. And then along comes a job center plus man, little man, you know, and he's very cocky because he's in a position of control. And he says, we found on the other side of Bath a part-time job. It's casual, no benefits, short-term, may finish in 3 or 4 weeks, but you have to take it. Or as the new rule is, you have to take a 0 hours contract job, which is not guaranteeing you any income. You have to take it. Now I ask any first-term, first-year student, do you think it's rational in those circumstances to take such a job? Because if you did, you could easily 3 weeks or 4 weeks later have to go back and start queuing all over again and prove a whole lot of other things. That's a precarity trap. And that's what millions of people are facing. And I cannot tell you how many emails I've received from people who want to tell me their story. Okay? Now the third part of the definition is the one that I've developed particularly in the new book, but I've got it in the first book, but it's more in the second, is that the precariat has distinctive relations to the state. And what that means is, not to government, to the state. They are denizens. A denizen was a 13th century concept, which was when a person came into a town, he or she, but mainly he, was given a more limited range of rights than the citizen of the town. So he was given for a shorter period and more clipped and so on. But unlike the denizens of the Middle Ages, the denizens of today are people in their millions who are losing all 5 forms of rights. They're losing civil rights. They can't use the law to get their rights. They're losing those civil rights. They're losing social rights. They can't get access to rights-based benefits. They're losing political rights because they don't have any political representation or capacity to vote. They're losing cultural rights because they can't belong to a community that gives meaning and citizenship to themselves as part of a community. We've seen those being disrupted. And they lose economic rights. They can't practice what they are qualified to do. And this situation leads to what I think is the most fundamental psychological part of the precariat. People in the precariat are increasingly supplicants. They're asking for favors. They're trying to please somebody to give them some charity. They're trying to be subservient and obsequious towards bureaucrats in order, please, give me some favor. You are a supplicant having to be a beggar with the state because you don't have rights and you don't have any security. And I think that this is being intensified by what I call the utilitarian consensus, the moralistic nature of modern politics, which is dividing society into different forms of dualisms. You see the politicians doing it all the time. Hard-working families versus scroungers. Hard-working adults versus youth. All these euphemisms of dualism that's going on. And it's always in a way of punishing the minority in favor of the majority. But actually, the minority is growing and growing and growing. So we're seeing a fundamental change taking place. And this is the key, because the precariat is developing a distinct consciousness around the world. It's a consciousness of relative deprivation and status frustration, but it's also a rather transformative consciousness because they are not trapped by labourism of the past. They are not habituated to expect that the best thing out there is a lifetime of full-time labour. The politicians present it as if that's the solution to the problem. But if you talk to precariat groups, as I've been doing, and learning from them around the world, that's not the consciousness that comes back, the energy that comes back. And 2 wonderful pieces of graffiti, for me, are beautiful. I've got lots of examples. But it's somehow these pieces of graffiti are actually speaking very, very loudly at the moment. And one was on a Madrid wall. Beautiful. The worst thing would be to return to the old normal. Very subversive if you think about it. Very subversive. And another one, beautiful. I happened to have met the woman who wrote it. My dreams are not in your ballot box. And that reflects the fact that the Precariat rejects the 20th century political mainstreams, the neoliberalism and the social democrats, the laborism and so on. And that is what you're seeing. Now, I want to be very brief on the next bit because I've suddenly realized that I'm not going to get onto the Charter. But that's because I'm hoping some of you will be interested enough to buy the Charter at a Precariat price. But the interesting thing about the Precariat as it is today is it is not yet a class for itself. It's a class in the making, and it's a dangerous class for two reasons. It's at war with itself, and it rejects those old political agendas. Why is it at war with itself? Because essentially it has three factions. The first faction are those people who are falling out of old working class communities. Their parents were dockers or shipbuilders or engineers or whatever, but they can't aspire to get there. But they don't have a lot of education. They don't go to Bath University. And they tend to listen to the sirens of the far right, the neo-fascist agendas, who are playing on their fears and saying, ha-ha, your insecurities and your plunging wages and your blah, 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 blah is due to this second group. Of course, the second faction in the Precariat are the migrants, are the ethnic minorities, the Roma, the disabled, all the groups that are socially marginalized and marginalizable. Now, the first group listens to the far right and they're atavistic in their orientation. The second group I call nostalgics. Those migrants today don't have any home. They have no place where they feel they have rights of citizenship. And worse and worse and worse, they are losing what little they have had. We see it everywhere, and I document it in the book. But the third part in the Precariat is the one that is growing fastest, and the one that is taking to the streets and in the Occupy movement and the Indignado and the Den Plerona movement and all the others. It's the educated who were sold a lottery ticket when they went to university or college. They were told going to university would lead to a career, would lead to a nirvana of stability and occupational definition. And they come out of university, and most of them have got their lottery ticket, which cost rather more than they hoped, and have very low probability of joining the salariat or the proficients. But more and more people are realizing that they are part of the Precariat, or they could easily become part of the Precariat, and are therefore altering their consciousness. And this leads to the final points I'm going to make because of time, which is that to go back to the Polanyian imagery, for a global transformation to occur, three principles have to be respected. The first, to realize that a new forward march towards more equality, towards more freedom, towards more security, will always be led by the interests and insecurities of the emerging mass class. That is the Precariat. The second principle is that any forward march to take place, new forms of collective action have to emerge and take place. New forms, not the old forms. I'm often asked to go and speak to trade union bodies, and I say, you have to alter your character completely, because there's one way I can empty a room when I'm talking to the Precariat, whether it's in Naples or whether it's in Madrid or anywhere else, and that's to start to talk about the unions. They'll all rush for the bar, long before I could get there. So you've got to alter the character of the actions. But let's make no mistake about it. We need collective associations. We need bodies to represent us collectively. But they have to re-articulate their agenda to the sort of things I talk about in the Charter. And the third and final principle is that for every new forward march in a transformation, is made up of three overlapping struggles. The first struggle is a struggle for recognition, a struggle for identity, so that instead of feeling sorry for yourself, you feel a part of something. And I think the fantastic achievements of the Occupy movements, and I had the great privilege of being asked to speak to a number of them, and the various other sort of protests that have taken place in the last 3 years, has been that this sense of recognition has moved forward. And instead of looking in the mirror in the morning and feeling sorry for yourself because you're useless, you're a failure, you're whatever, you look in the mirror and you say, I am part of a group. We are facing a common set of insecurities and challenges. It's structures and processes that are creating these insecurities. But I know that it's not because of me. It's because of these structures. And that sense of recognition must come if there's going to be a counter-movement. You must be able to see yourself as subject in order to join with others and start working for an alternative. The second struggle is a struggle for representation. Here we've hardly started. And here I would challenge those people working on social policy, because the precariat should be represented in all the bodies of social policy, all the bodies and governance that are taking place. Their voice must be subject, not just treated as objects to be reformed or retrained or blah, 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 or punished and sanctioned. You've got to be part of that, the precariat. And the third struggle is a struggle for redistribution. But distribution of what? Distribution of what? And here I think we must understand the nature of this transformation, because it will not be like the old socialist project at the beginning of the 20th century. It won't be for the means of production. It won't be for the factories and mines. It will be for the key assets that are more unequally distributed today than income itself. What are they? Let's start with security. Security, basic economic social security, is far more unequally distributed than you can possibly imagine. If you're in the precariat, you have no security at all. No security. If you're up here, you have every bit you want. The second, and there are 6 altogether that I develop in the Charter, the second is control of time. Those upper class groups have control of time. They can buy expertise, do whatever they like, but if you're in a precariat, you have no control of time. And time is vital if you're trying to make an occupational life, if you're trying to be in control of your development, of your human capacities. The third is quality space. Public space. We need a fight for the commons. A fight to regenerate the public quality spaces and orient our society to attack this privatization that is taking away the social commons, the other physical commons and so on. It's a very important part of the precariat debate. That's why Gezi Park in Istanbul was such a fantastic experience. The next one is education. Because education is terribly unequal at the moment. If you're up in the elite, you get your elite education. But more and more in the precariat, you have a commodified education that is rote learning and so on. We need a struggle for that. The next key asset, key resource, is financial knowledge. If you don't have financial knowledge today, or access to financial knowledge, you pay a heavy price. Whereas if you do have such access, you can increase your income, you can avoid taxes, you can get subsidies. And of course, the biggest recipient of subsidies in this country, by a long way, is a certain Mr. Ian Duncan Smith, who has received over £1 million in state subsidies. Meanwhile, he's telling everybody else that they must have cuts in their benefits. They have expertise, you see. They can get these things. I document that over $1 million in my book. And the last two is we need a redistribution of financial capital and rental capital. And this leads to the argument that I don't have time to develop, but has developed at length in my whole life work, if you like, which is we need to move to a new distribution system. We cannot expect wages to rise. If we pretend that we're going to have a living wage campaign and minimum wage thing, you're little blimps of success. But it's not going to alter the dynamics. Please. We need a new system. And that means we need to give people a basic income as a right. And we need sovereign wealth funds to redistribute capital. And I'll end with a little story. Just take 2 minutes and then I will shut up. I was invited to speak in Middlesbrough. Anybody from Middlesbrough here? Okay, congratulations. No, I'm serious. I'm serious. Because you will understand what I'm about to say. I was invited to talk to in Middlesbrough. And when I got there, the two people who'd been doing work on the Precariat, and that's why I think they invited me, said, Guy, would you like to go around? I said, of course. They took me to their research areas, and they took me up the hill where the old town hall was surrounded by weeds and so on. Middlesbrough, in the 1820s, was a little village. And then suddenly they discovered iron ore. And within 15 years, Middlesbrough became almost the centre of the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire. If you go to San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge was built with iron ore from Middlesbrough. If you go to Sydney, Sydney Harbour Bridge was built with iron ore from Middlesbrough. If you work in India, when you see the railways, you realise most of the railway line was built with iron ore from Middlesbrough. But if you go to Middlesbrough today, you see council houses boarded up with concrete blocks. You see weeds growing, you see people without hope and despair, anomic parts of the precariat, wallowing in poverty and deprivation. But down in the south of England, the descendants of the people who made the wealth from all the production of the Middlesbroughs of our country are still wallowing in luxury and becoming part of the cabinet in going to Eton and so on. And if you go back to Thomas Paine, and Headley here, who's a great supporter of Thomas Paine, if you go back to Thomas Paine in his wonderful book, 1795, his argument essentially was this, that the income and wealth of any of us in this room is far more due to the efforts of our forebears than anything you or I do. And in a sense, you don't know whose forebear is responsible for our income. So you can treat the thought of a basic income as a social dividend on the efforts of the past. That's an ethical justification. In the books, I give economic justifications as well. But for me, that ethical justification and the Middlesbrough example is a powerful moral reason why we should move in that direction. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.